The 1970s. Wow, what a great era. The 1970s were literally the anything goes decade. And so for some, the uglier and the clinkier the fashion, the better. For others, soft and feminine was the answer. And no matter what you dug through making a fashion statement, it reached its apex in the 1970s. 1970s were an intensely tumultuous time with various cultures and subcultures that usually were coming out into the open at once. Idealism. Cynicism abound as a militant feminism, civil rights, and Watergate scandals, as well as Vietnam War, brought gritty reality into the forefront of that era. Now, these influences gave designers a new ammunition, and the public was eager for the latest fashion wave. Like, for instance, Halston was the man at that time. The Studio 54, where he really he brought this ultra suede. That was like his thing. I mean, he really brought that up, and yet he kept women very classic and very sensual and sexy, but really modern at the same time. The idealism of the 60s had long since disappeared into the wind once the 70s came around, and they were increasing the anxiety about global population and the exhaustion of the Earth's natural resources. So, global warming and all that stuff started really coming into play in the 70s. There was a lot of emission and manufacturing emissions coming out, and there was a lot of smog issues, especially in the bigger cities. And growing up in Los Angeles, I remember that we would have these days where we had to stay inside because there was a smog alert. And now that many of the government has put a lot of emission laws into place, that doesn't happen as much anymore, thank God, because it was really bad. Sometimes you could really feel it in your lungs. The 1970s definitely seen the war in the Middle East, the war in Vietnam, which was one of the big ones, that had ended there when there was a corruption in the highest levels of American government with Watergate, and then President Nixon resignation after the Watergate scandal, and also the oil crisis. There was the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia that had turned its feudal land into killing fields. It was really crazy. And there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a lot going on politically in the 1970s. Basically it was a daily diet of world's troubles, that brought into the homes of the West, and television was definitely one of the things. The first man who walked on the moon. I mean, so much happened in this era. The 1970s were a time of distinctive and vibrant fashion. Disco culture focused on tight-fitting clothing, strobe lights and mirror balls. Studio 54. Women's makeup reflected this glitzy atmosphere, and makeup associated with disco culture was designed to grab attention and be anything but subtle. I grew up in the 70s. I was a little kid, and so I do remember a lot of this, and so I do kind of reflect on those times because it was such a crazy era, and I do feel that I was fortunate enough to experience that because I was able to see a lot of the transitions of how women really emerged to becoming more independent. Even after the 70s ended, the disco makeup look stands out as a unique visual representation of the era and subculture. Movies and television shows such as Charlie's Angels were having a huge increase and profound effect on fashion. Cultural icons such as Wonder Woman created a lust for interesting boots, often teamed up with hot pants and short skirts. And boots might be shiny vinyl texture and bejeweled and covered with psychedelic and floral designs. But they were seldom boring, that's for sure. Now, feminism and the natural look influenced natural looks were still very popular during the 1970s. Through some feminist movements in the 70s, They continued to wear cosmetics many others did not. Susan Brown Miller, for instance, called an unadorned face the horrible new look of feminism, and the cosmetic industry faced with increasing mainstream rejection of sexual objectification. I can't say that word. Sexual objectification began a market makeup as natural and indivisible, with that whole natural vibe going on. 1970s, they did like moon drops, which was a huge thing for the lips. People wore had very flawless, fresh, see-through skin. Fragrances were marketed towards the new woman, if you will, and like Charlie, for instance, and Gina Tay, whose ads were very no-nonsense, pantsuit-clad, independent women. And they also brought out cigarettes for women, like Virginia Slims, and made that very chic, which isn't great now. It was definitely a marketing triumph. And, becoming nation's leading, sellers in the marketplace. Especially like Charlie was so huge, and I believe that was like Sybil Shepherd, and that era was like a very big era for models. Cheryl Tiegs, androgynous cosmetics were also seen as appropriate for the business world, where working women felt increasingly pressured to present a meticulous appearance. And one person I would say that you would want to use as a reference is Mary Tyler Moore. That was a very big, iconic influence of what makeup looked like as for the independent woman, as well as That Girl with Marlo Thomas. Those are really good shows. And then you have the Brady Bunch and the Partridge Family. Those are really big, iconic shows that I think really reflect the 70s. Now, there's similar aesthetics were seen elsewhere in the fashion world. In the 1970s, American fashion designers such as Ralph Lauren and Calvin Klein presented an understated neutral designs accompanied by natural makeup. And a similar look was embraced by photographer Francesco Scavullo and makeup artist Wade Bandy, who I had the honors to work with. I assisted him prior to his passing. And so that was a really amazing time for me in the early 80s, when I was able to meet him and work with him and learn so much from him. He's the one that told me to use my fingers. So Wade Bandy was very iconic. To me, he was like the first makeup artist I think everyone would love to be back then. He was the guy. He was definitely the man that, influenced even till this day me as a makeup artist. Wade Bandy definitely has to take the credit for that. There was hairstylist Maury Hobson who collaborated on covers of Cosmopolitan, and that established the 1970s as a natural look. Bandy's philosophy, described in his book Design Your Face, which is such a, if you can get it, definitely get it, because it still rings very true now, held that makeup should be not used as a mask, but rather to alter perception and proportion, creating a personalized ideal face. And he also used that as sexualized glamour. The more dramatic makeup was often worn towards the evenings. Makeup, because they usually went and kind of let loose in the disco. So, and fashion was very big. So that was a time when women really would step it up after it got dark. Makeup used by European fashion designers in the 70s presented a central look for women in striking contrast to the natural look. Through models of, say Yves Saint Laurent, hugely influenced runway shows, and they wore menswear and short, slick black hair, and their lips were glossy and bright red. YSL's cosmetics line were also employed intense feminine colors. In the violent sexual porno chic fashion photography of French and Italian Vogue, women wore blood red lipstick, glossy lipstick, red glossy nail polish, pencil thin eyebrows, and black eye makeup. So if you think about this, a lot of the influences from the 70s, they took it from the 20s and 30s, and then they also added some 50s and 60s influence, and they kind of made their own. Very interesting, because in the 20s the eyebrows were very thin, and so they really kind of went back with that sexual revolution phase. Women employed the vision of beauty for evenings and when they could aim to seduce in the eras of the discos. There was also punk, and punk had a huge influence in the 70s as well. Singer Susie Banshee, she was huge. 1974, she wore raspberry colored lip gloss and pencil thin eyebrows, and that was a very popular trend in the punk and glam era. The punk movement that emerged in the late 70s aimed to provoke rather than follow the trends of the day. And the movement, described as anti-beauty by Kate de Castelbajac, embraced intentionally artificial and aggressive makeup, tattooing, and body piercing to shock observers. So the punks really took on that whole movement. Black fluorescent and neo-tribalism were major aesthetic elements. Images of glam rockers like Alice Cooper, David Bowie, and Lou Reed in the pages of Rolling Stone established the influence of another extreme aesthetic. Like, men were very feminine, and the glam style drew on transvestism, androgyny, decadence, and camp. Its blasé sophistication stood in marked contrast to the innocence and sincerity of the 1960s. So glitter eyeshadow and nail varnish were very popular with men as well in this period. Product developments and trends were very big at this time, because it was just kind of all over across the board. It wasn't just for women. And music played a huge part in this whole aspect of makeup. Women tend to wear lighter foundations in the 1970s, which greatly increased the market for skincare. Anti-aging products were also increasingly important. Intensely colored blush carried over from the 1960s. Definitely, was one of those things that I think we don't realize how blush, played a very important role, but in the 70s, the intense colors even got more intense, say from then the 60s. The tube blush was also extremely popular. Lipstick in the 70s and tended to be either intense color and always glossy. Popular hues included deep pink, purple, and raspberry. Improvements in chemistry enabled the introduction of waterproof mascara, along with better lash lengtheners and thickeners. Matte colors were very popular for the eyes, in contrast of the iridescence and characterized 60s makeup. The decade's competing visions of beauty were seen in its dichotomy, and then eyeshadows, colors, both dramatic smoky dark gray and transparent natural beiges and grays, were very popular. Coming with what happened in the 70s, there was some very big transitions that came through all along from the early to the end of the 60s. The 60s played a huge part in a lot of the rebellion and bright colors, but the 70s really kind of took it to another level, and then towards the end of the 70s to the 80s it really transitioned to a whole nother thing. So definitely, like, Saturday Night Fever is a really good movie to watch. That's very iconic of the 70s. There's a lot of TV shows that I listed earlier, so definitely go into that more and more, and you will definitely see how you will be probably doing a lot more influence from this era, because a lot of this era also took from the 20s, 30s, and even earlier on in many cases. So yeah, 1970s was definitely a very interesting era, and one that was definitely influential in fashion.